see. Okay, we are connecting. We should be broadcasting live now. So let's see.
Yep.
We have somebody, hey Em, I see you joining. We have Emily and Michaela joining. Just so everybody knows, and I'll repeat this again later, there should be a chat function available to you. If you have questions as we go on, feel free to type them in. We're also saving a few minutes of questions at the end if you want to type anything in. In the meantime, if you guys just want to type in with a little introduction, your name, where you're connecting with us from, that would be great. Okay, let's see. Emily and Max from Brooklyn are joining us. Hi, guys. We have a few more people, but maybe they're either shy or don't have chat capabilities at the moment. We're just gonna hang out for a couple minutes as some people join. As I just mentioned, if you have questions as we go on or comments, anything you wanna share, this is a presentation, but pretty conversational too. So feel free to chat in as we're going. We have Michaela from Kansas City. Hey, Michaela. And we have more people joining. As I mentioned, feel free just to use the chat box to introduce yourselves and where you're joining us from. We're just gonna give it another minute or so, and then we're gonna get started. Hey, we have Morgan from Portland, Oregon with us, Debbie from Buffalo, New York. Welcome everybody. Glad everybody could join us live right now. I'm in Brooklyn, by the way, just so you all know where I am at the moment. And we're just gonna get started. As I mentioned, if you have any questions as we go along or just comments you wanna throw out, this is a presentation, but it's also a group that's pretty conversational. So feel free to use the chat function in order to communicate, and I will read those out to Christina. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jennifer Levin. I'm the creator and moderator of Caregiver Collective, which is an online support group and resource for millennials and Gen X who are in the role of family caregiver. Caregiver Collective has members from all over the world, which is pretty awesome. We're getting more and more every day. And basically we use the group as a way to connect with each other no matter where or when we are, because our schedules vary so much as caregivers. And I try to provide monthly support chats through Zoom for everybody to connect live with somebody, kind of see each other's faces, as well as do these webinars. And with the current pandemic happening right now, it has raised so many emotions and complications for everybody, really. And for caregivers, specifically those younger in the role who may, be living alone or not have the support of their siblings, or, might have young children in the house. There are so many new complications, so many new emotions that go behind caregiving, kind of maybe just when you thought you had a grasp on everything. So today I figured let's have a webinar with someone who knows what they're talking about to address all of the different things that are going on right now, and how as caregivers, specifically millennial caregivers, we can cope when there's so much that's completely out of our control. So with us, we have Christina Irving, who is the Client Services Director of the Family Caregiver Alliance in San Francisco. So I'm going to let Christina take it away.
Great, thanks Jennifer, and it's good to be here with everybody. Even though we're all kind of coming from all over the place, and as Jennifer said, I'm in San Francisco. My background behind me is actually Kauai. If you're looking at the picture of me speaking at all, we've been on so many Zoom calls and webinars, and we're like, we all just need to see something that looks a little bit more soothing and relaxing than a lot of what our current environment is. Definitely feel free to put in chat questions or comments if there's things that hopefully will resonate with you or spark ideas of things that you're doing that you want to share with others. I think that's a great way for people to learn, is from other caregivers who are kind of in the same boat. So hopefully you all will be able to share ideas and thoughts as well as I'm talking today. So my goal really is to kind of talk about what our current environment kind of looks like and what this is bringing up for caregivers. You know, what are some of the challenges and issues that might be coming up, and what are some ways that hopefully we all can cope with it, find ways that are kind of like healthy and productive for us, so that all of you and myself included are doing kind of as well as we can, given how much of our current environment is outside of our control and how stressful and overwhelming and frustrating and anxiety causing it is right now. So I'm going to go through some things, again, questions at any time, and Jennifer, feel free to jump in if there's something in particular, and you can ask those questions of me. All right, so as we start talking, so some of this, not a surprise to you, you're living this, you know it, but given our current pandemic, it's creating all these additional challenges and stressors for caregivers. You're already kind of juggling lots of roles. That's just a part of caregiving frequently, especially if you're working full-time or also parenting, or maybe just have other sorts of caregiving responsibilities, but now you're doing it from home. And that obviously creates a lot of other challenges because you're probably trying to focus on your job, things that you need to get done, and maybe the responsibilities and the pressures that you're getting from your work, but also worrying about this other person that you're caring for and trying to make sure that they're safe and taken care of and have what they need. We're hearing from a lot of caregivers about some added financial pressures. There's a lot of financial loss that comes just with caregiving, unfortunately, either lost wages, people who retire early, have a hard time being in positions where they can get promotions because they're taking time off. So that's a stressor just as part of caregiving. But we're hearing from a lot of caregivers, and this is frequently some of those who are younger, who might be losing jobs because they work in the restaurant industry, in the hotel or hospitality industry, those who work in schools, and schools are shut down, and they may or may not be in positions where the school districts are keeping them on. And that's a huge worry. And while there's been some protections in some states about evictions, that unfortunately has not been an across-the-board concern by kind of politicians and policymakers. So I know that that's still a big worry for caregivers. And obviously you're dealing with potentially really challenging behaviors and sometimes very small spaces. And even if your home didn't feel that small before, it probably feels a little bit smaller now. And so how do we juggle that? And how do we make sure that we have some sort of separation and don't feel like we're going to lose our minds either ourselves or just get overly frustrated and annoyed at the other people around us? I mentioned this before, but a lot of kind of the stress that's coming now with COVID-19 and with this pandemic is the sense of loss of control and uncertainty. Those are two of the major stressors of caregiving in general, and I think those have been really amplified by right now. And those are two things that we can't always do much about, but we need to find ways to cope with them, because unfortunately there's nothing we can do to change the huge course of this. There are things that we can do on our own, but there's nothing we can do that's going to end the shelter-in-place requirements any faster. There's nothing we can do that is going to change the diagnosis or health condition of the person we're caring for. So what we need to do is figure out what are the things that we don't have control over, how do we deal with that and cope with that, and then where are the areas that we have some control and what can we do, and what might be helpful and help us adapt to this and cope with this. So that's what we'll try and talk about a little bit today. Some of you might be caring for somebody who lives in the same home with you. And again, that separation of space is really important to find in some way or another. You may not be able to get out very easily right now. The person you're caring for might be somebody who really shouldn't be going out if they're in a higher risk population. So how do you still kind of within that household provide a little bit of space for yourself so that you get some downtime to relax? And there's, I think, lots of different ideas and ways of doing that. You might try and schedule a walk outside the home at a time that you know that person you're caring for is kind of resting or maybe taking a nap or is engaged in some other activity, so you know that they're okay. And so finding ways to keep them busy is a real challenge. And then we'll chat a little bit about that and the resource list that I put together that you may have gotten already or will get. Hopefully we'll have some other ideas as well for you. So some other tools and tips that I hope will be useful in finding ways to keep that other person in your life busy and to keep yourself busy sometimes. If you're caregiving remotely for somebody, so either they're in a care facility or maybe they just live in their own home and you're not nearby, we want to look at what are the communication tools. How do you stay connected to them so that you're able to check in on how they're doing, that they're able to hear from you? That might ease a little bit of your anxiety and your worry, and then really connecting with community resources so that you're not dealing with this all on your own if you're not able to get to them as frequently as possible. Again, some of these ideas are on that resource handout, so hopefully those will be helpful, but I will highlight in terms of communication tools, there are some great devices. Some things as simple as if they have a smartphone, setting up video calls with them if they're able to. But if it's somebody who can't really initiate a video call, there are tools like the Amazon Echo, the Show. There's a drop-in feature where you literally drop in on their call or on their device, and they don't have to press a button. So some people might have privacy concerns about that, but it does mean, though, that if they, because of dementia or mobility issues, have trouble kind of pushing or swiping those buttons on a tablet or a phone, if they have one of those Amazon Echo devices, you could literally just drop in and suddenly you're there and able to see and communicate with them. So there are some tricks and some things that hopefully are helpful and allow you to still maintain that communication because that adds a lot of stress when you don't know how that other person is doing and if they're not as easily able to communicate with you. I think this is a great area for you all to continue talking about because chances are a number of you have been dealing with this. And I think this is where other caregivers are going to have lots of ideas also. So we'll touch on some of these as we're talking about kind of tools and community resources. Also be thinking about sharing with each other what you're using and what you're doing. In terms of facilities, there have been some great resources that have been put out there. A couple that have come out just today. So I'll just kind of mention that briefly, I think, as a resource because I wasn't able to add it to the list before I sent it. But there's a wonderful national policy organization called Justice in Aging, and they have a webinar coming up shortly about kind of visitation rights and care in facilities. And so that will be, I think it's either later this week or next week is that webinar. So you can look out for information from Justice in Aging, and I can try and shoot that out to Jennifer to share later as well. So lots of stress you're all going through, again, compounded and added to it by this current pandemic and all of the shelter-in-place issues and all of the added worries about somebody's health and well-being. And how does that actually affect you? And this, I think, is really important for each person to think about because everyone's a little bit different. We all experience stress and overwhelm and burnout in different ways, but we often don't notice it super early. So what I want you to do is just take a minute, look through some of these symptoms and think about what's common for you. How do you normally experience stress? And if you're comfortable doing so, put it in the chat box to share with other people. I will say for me, what I notice is mostly in that cognitive box. It's the anxious thoughts and the worry. So that's where, those thoughts and ruminations just kind of run through your head and it's hard to kind of quiet your brain. What I notice is when my stress level goes beyond, kind of normal stress to really overly stressed is when it starts to have those behavioral effects, where then those running thoughts mean that I don't sleep well. And so when I don't sleep well, then it affects the emotional, and then I tend to be a little bit more irritable and a little less patient with people. And so this is a lot of where the foundation of kind of cognitive behavioral therapy comes from. It's this idea that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all interconnected. And so if we pay attention to how we experience the world, it helps us figure out what's driving maybe behaviors that aren't so good for us. It helps us figure out what thoughts are triggering our emotions and what emotions trigger our thoughts, and find ways to kind of better cope with things. So really important to kind of know what's normal for you, know how you experience these stressors, because when we talk more about some coping tools, this is important to know kind of what's normal for you, to know what might be most helpful for you as well. And really the whole goal of this is, how do we build resilience? And there's lots of definitions of resilience out there, but the one that I'll share with you that I think is really helpful is the idea that resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. And if that doesn't define kind of the situation that we're all in right now, I don't know what else does. You know, we definitely have significant sources of stress. That's part of caregiving. That's definitely part of dealing with a very serious virus. And there's a lot of threat that comes with that. You know, we don't know who's going to get sick and what that's going to look like. And potentially as a result of that, there is a lot of trauma and tragedy that's happening. So it's, how do we build up our resilience? And this does not mean that these stressors, these difficult life circumstances, that they don't bother us, that they don't affect us in the same way, but it's how well we adapt to it. How well do we bounce back? Does it completely drag us down and we have nothing left and we are so burned out and overwhelmed that we have no capacity to continue? Or are we able to find ways to deal with it and cope with it and still move on and hopefully have kind of overall healthy and well-adjusted lives? So some of the key ways that we can help build resilience. Yeah, Jennifer, did you?
I have a question about this actually, because
Yeah.
I find that with the typical caregiver role, it's like you can work to build a baseline of where you're not overstressed, you know, you're managing, hopefully you've gotten a routine down, whatever that looks like. And then of course there's the inevitable fall or whatever it is that kind of like sends you reeling. With this crisis right now, I find emotional states of a lot of people I speak to be so different that the lapses between different behavioral patterns happen much faster. So it's like you can give yourself a moment of amnesia and watch a movie or whatever it is, and then out of nowhere, the rug is pulled out from under you and you're like, oh my God, that's right, what's going on again? I'm freaked out. And whereas with typical caregiving, maybe that happens once a day, hopefully it doesn't, but like with this, it seems to happen like once an hour. So how would you recommend dealing with that differently than we've dealt with our regular like coping in caregiving? Do we practice more of these things, or?
It is about practicing more of it. There's not necessarily some unique set of tools to deal with this current environment. It's more just emphasizing the need to build up those strategies and those tools in ourselves. Those things like, you know, taking a break and watching a movie and being able to get away from it all for a moment, those are really helpful. It doesn't mean that we're not still aware of everything that's happening and everything that's going on in the world, but it gives our brain a chance to kind of decompress for a little bit. When we look at kind of how stress affects ourselves over time, particularly when we're looking at chronic stress, which is what most caregivers are experiencing, we have this buildup of adrenaline and cortisol in our system. You know, those are the stress hormones. That's the fight or flight that says, okay, there's a danger, I need to fight back, I need to run away, I need to respond to it. And those hormones are really healthy and helpful for us in a short period of time. What happens is over a long period of time, that's a little unhealthy. So our current situation is in some ways this weird mix of both kind of acute and chronic. like there's the chronic stress that you've been living in for a long time. And then there's these amplifications. There's a fall, there's a hospitalization, there's some change in health. And then we see these little spikes of kind of stress level. We're kind of dealing with that now, but that spike is actually then lasting into a chronic stress model because this has been going on for, at this level, almost a month. We're expecting at least another month of this. It's not going to go away right away. And so we need to really almost be increasing our awareness of our bodies, of our minds, of our emotions, and figuring out what's going to be helpful for me right now. The better we've been doing with finding ways to kind of manage our stress and get resources and get support and cope with things, the easier it is to adjust to this kind of spike that we're experiencing right now in our stressors. But even if you haven't, if anything, that means it's even more important to try and do some of these tools now, because we do have this extra layer of kind of stress and worry and fear in our lives right now. And so it's how do we respond to that and cope with it? We can't make this virus go away anytime soon. We can't change the caregiving scenario in the sense that this person has a chronic health issue, has dementia, has whatever condition it is that you're dealing with. That's not necessarily going to go away. So how do we cope with it? How do we adapt to it, especially in the face of what is really significant and new stressors? So it just makes it even more important to figure out what are those coping tools that we can use, and knowing that the ones that we've been using before may not be working anymore. We may need to find different and new ones because we don't have some of the same resources in the past. And I think there's a real need for us all to be more creative in finding, resources and solutions. Of course, being creative requires that you can think through things and process things. And when we're really stressed out, we're not always so good at doing that. So it just, again, it makes everything harder. What was hard before is now even harder now because you don't have some of the same resources and tools you used to. And yet we need those supports even more. And the idea of resilience is also, you'll see on here kind of building connections and seeking help. And so there are those ways that we reach out to others. But some of the other parts of this are really the internal processes of how do we build up resilience, regardless of what our external resources is. What do we have as individual people to help cope and adapt and adjust to these changes? And those are actually the things that we have most control over. We can't always create new services and new resources out there. We could have a whole other conversation sometime about advocacy and policy needs for caregivers, and that's a huge issue, and there's such a huge need for that. And we're seeing some of those actually come into play now in some ways where there are more people in a caregiving role than there were before. People who are mostly independent but are at higher risk, so maybe can't get out as much. And so we're seeing some more services come into play that have always been needed, but just haven't been created before. And so hopefully those will continue even after we've gotten through this current situation. But in the immediate, we can't create quickly kind of new resources and services. So those internal resources are the things that we have the most control over. Does not mean that they're easy to change and develop. So the first one, and this is kind of where I wanted to start talking about, is about our thoughts and the idea of embracing healthy thoughts. And we have the most control over anything else in our life, over our thoughts, but only really if we pay attention to them and think about them. And we're not so good about doing that, especially when you're trying to juggle 10 million things and get a million things done during the day. But we need to figure out, how do we think about things? And this is from a woman who took care of her husband with cancer. And she said, you can't control the situation, but you need to think clearly to understand how to navigate it. And that thinking clearly is so important. It's so hard to do when we're stressed and when we're emotional. Caregiving is an emotional piece. It affects your life. There's the life of another person that you're thinking about. This pandemic creates a lot of emotions. There's a lot of fear and worry. And again, some of those things we can't control the situation, but we need to be able to think through it as clearly as we can, because that's what helps us figure out how do we navigate it, how do we find the resources and supports that are available. We listen to what we tell ourselves. So our brain hears it. We're not always aware of it though. And it's an interesting distinction, and it's one that can be really difficult to think through. This is where having sometimes a friend or a support group, oftentimes a therapist is really helpful. We need somebody to help mirror our thoughts and help us recognize what are these things that we're thinking and telling ourselves that may not be so helpful. So sometimes with overgeneralizing, this idea of everything is horrible right now, nothing is good, nothing feels safe, nothing is going to get better. And it's like, is that totally true? And it doesn't mean that you have to get super Pollyanna and think, oh, it's all great, it's all wonderful. No, but it's having that perspective of realizing that, yes, a lot of things are crazy and horrible right now. And are there certain things that are going well? And I think for caregivers, what's even more important is not just thinking there are things that are going well, but recognizing what you are doing well. So often caregivers focus on, I can't do anything right, I'm not getting everything done I need to do during the day. And you might be discounting all the things that you do accomplish every day, all the ways that you are supporting the person you're caring for, all the ways you might be supporting other family members, all the things that you got done in your job that day that went well. And how do you notice those things also? And so part of what comes with that is all the I shoulds. I should have been able to get more done. I should be able to convince her not to go outside because it's not safe. I, should have been more patient with my child, or, with my dad with dementia, all the I should have, and realizing that there's not just one way to do things. We're not always going to get things right either. But allowing ourselves that flexibility to find out what's going to work for me right now, and that there's not just one right answer. Hindsight is 20/20, so we can look back sometimes and realize, oh, I should have done things differently. And it's like, well, no, knowing what I know now, I might have done this differently back then. But that doesn't mean that what I did at the time wasn't the best I could have done. Especially right now, I think we're so worried about what could come next. Again, a common, I think, concern for caregivers is that worry and of going to the worst case scenario. They're going to fall, they're going to break a hip, they're going to end up in a hospital, they're going to get sick, they're going to die. And now we see it as they're going to go outside, they're going to get infected by somebody, they're going to end up in a hospital on a ventilator, and they're going to die. And we go to this worst case scenario of trying to predict the future. And well, we want to think about what are ways that we can reduce risk, what are steps that we can take that are helpful. We want to make sure that we're doing it, again, in a productive way. So if I just say they're going to go outside and they're going to get sick and they're going to end up in the hospital and they're going to die, that doesn't give me any ability to control or take steps that might be helpful. And so we want to kind of really think through those things and not try and overly predict the future. And realizing that when we do make mistakes or when we don't do things as well as we think we could have, that does not define all of who you are as a person. When we think about all these as unhelpful thoughts, the idea is that they don't help us find solutions. They don't help us figure out what action steps I can take. What could I do that might make my situation better? Or they don't help us recognize, again, all the things that I am doing well. They don't kind of reinforce those behaviors that are helpful and that are healthy for us. So we really need to start tuning in to how we think about things. And it's a hard practice to get into. It is not an easy thing because we tend to do these very subconsciously and we're not always aware of how we're thinking. But you might notice that having a lot of these thoughts is what leads you to start feeling really anxious and really overwhelmed and really depressed. Right now, maybe just really scared. And so when you notice that you're feeling that way, you might stop to think about, what am I thinking? What are my worries and my concerns right now? Sometimes writing these things down can be helpful because it gives us a way to look at it and read it and then evaluate it. But sometimes that's too hard to do on our own. And that is where, again, therapists, counselors, supportive people can be really helpful in this process because we have the most control over our thoughts. We just need to recognize them. What a lot of those unhelpful thoughts lead to is a lot of guilt. Super common caregiver emotion, and I think, again, even more worrisome right now. You know, I should stop them from going outside. I should not get frustrated. I should be more patient when, you know, my mom asked me the same question for the 50th time and I'm on a work call and I get really frustrated and impatient with her. I shouldn't have done that. She has dementia. She doesn't know any better. I should be able to get all my work done. I should be able to make more visits. All these I should. And what it does, it just sets us up for failure because we're not going to be perfect people. That is not going to happen. There's a quote by the artist, I believe Salvador Dali, who says something like, "Have no fear of perfection, you'll never reach it." And on the one hand, that might be a really depressing thought, but it also is a realistic thought. It's like, we're not going to get there. Does it mean we can't still be progressing and there aren't things that we can learn and do better with? But let's not set ourselves up for failure. And really thinking about the difference between guilt and regret. Guilt is I've done something wrong. I've done something to hurt or offend another person. And it can actually then be a healthy emotion because it says I need to make amends. I need to say I'm sorry, or maybe there is something I need to learn about how I could have done something differently. Regret is defined as the sorrow or sadness we feel about circumstances outside of our control. I can't control this virus right now. I can't control that there are people getting sick. I can't control that, you know, my loved one is somebody who is in a high-risk group, and so there's certain activities that they should not be doing. I may not even be in control of that person, not going outside, not going to see friends, not going to the grocery store. I can't control that. And so I feel sorrow and I feel sadness and I feel fear about those things. But I don't necessarily need to feel guilt because I don't have control over or ownership over those things. And it may feel like an issue of semantics. Sometimes it's just a language of we're making that distinction. But the problem is when we try and take that ownership of it, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make anything better because we're trying to control something that we can't control. What we may want to do and look at, are there things that I can control that would help those situations? Maybe. And then that's more helpful because those are things that we can actually do. And so we may see a better result as opposed to sitting there feeling like this is not going to get better because I'm trying to control something that is outside of my power. So it's a hard thing to do, but really taking that step back and saying, is this something I can actually do something about? Great, let me try and do something about it. Or is this something that I'm just going to get more frustrated and sad and scared about because I can't change the other people? Isolation, I think, is something that if people weren't feeling this before, they're probably feeling it now. So I love when I see that there are Facebook groups for caregivers or, you know, support groups or telephone groups, because it's so needed to have that connection and to connect with people who understand what you're going through. And I think particularly for caregivers who are younger. And I know this is really, you know, millennials and Gen X, and we see actually England has done a really good job about, they talk about young caregivers, talking about like school age caregivers. So people who are in, you know, maybe high school and junior high. And your peer group doesn't necessarily know what you're going through. Like they don't get it. They're not doing the same thing. And so having these connections is really important because there can be a lot of feelings of abandonment, that there's nobody else who's stepping up, that those friends that you had, they don't get it. And when you can't go out and you say no to requests all the time, that they drop away. And right now, nobody can step up in a lot of ways. You know, people can't come over and visit as easily. So it just kind of adds to that isolation. We don't have a good system for resources and supports for caregivers, for caring for older adults, for elder care, for caring for people with disabilities. We have a horribly fractured and disjointed system. And so it is hard to navigate, and that can lead to people feeling like there's not even any support out there. some families are better than others about, really connecting with each other, but not all of them are. And so then that often leaves that one caregiver who's kind of having to do it on their own. And right now we're just seeing even more of those social supports lost, that it's hard to get out and see friends and family. And while, there are a lot of people who are doing, virtual meals and virtual happy hours, when you're caregiving, it's still hard to schedule that. Yes, it's great that people are willing to do things virtually because that may make it a little bit easier for a caregiver. Still is going to be hard to juggle that. And so we need to find those connections with people who really understand it and get it. And so obviously you all have done that because somehow you have found this Caregiver Collective and you have made these connections. And this is, again, it's something that it's hard to do, but where we can seek this support and make these connections, it will help us build and develop those feelings of resilience so that we don't feel like we're in it alone all the time. And even if the people around us can't solve everything, to know that somebody else gets it and kind of understands where I'm coming from, that's going to make a big difference. So the more you can seek out those supports, even if you don't have the ability to spend a huge amount of time with them, the better. Okay.
Sorry, as you were talking about the fractured system, Michaela said, I agree wholeheartedly. And and you talking about, the need to connect with people who are going through something similar, yes, that is absolutely always true. And I do notice in the Caregiver Collective Facebook page right now, lately there have been an uptick that I've noticed of people saying, I just need to vent, but, and within minutes, no joke, within minutes, it's comments just like, feel free to say whatever you want, vent away, you need to get this off your chest. Like, people know how important that is and are willing to hear and don't think that you're bitching. They know how important it is just to voice these things sometimes and to have it fall on someone who gets it. So I have noticed that during this period, people are using the platform to do that more, which I think is great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get that with clients sometimes where I'll feel bad because we're playing a lot of phone tag, especially now when everyone's working remotely. And, I had a caregiver before, but it's like, oh, I'm so sorry we keep missing each other. And her message back to me was, oh, that's okay. It's nice just to vent to your voicemail for a while and know that you're going to hear it and that you will respond to me. And so it's like, okay, good. I feel a little bit better about that. And yeah, we want to be able to vent and get out those emotions, and that can help with the isolation. And then that other piece that, we'll talk about is that action piece. Again, if we're really going to build up resilience, we need that support. We need to be able to vent. And then we need to figure out what are the steps that I can take and what can I do. But the other piece that I don't talk about caregiving in general without talking about grief and loss, because I feel like it's often not talked about as much. We think about grief and loss when somebody has died, but when we are caregiving and you're dealing with anybody with a chronic illness, there is grief and loss. There's the loss that they're experiencing, that they're experiencing because of their illness, and there's the loss that you're experiencing because it's changed your life. It's changed how you interact with other people and what your roles are. And so this is when you have any kind of change, you often have loss, and when you have loss, you have grief. I worry even more now. I was talking with a colleague about this, that, for caregivers, it's hard because we don't have a lot of rituals around the grief and loss of caregiving because the person is still alive. So there's no funeral or memorial when you're going through all this grieving process of a caregiver. Well, now when there are people dying of COVID-19, even then we're losing some of our rituals because people are not able to participate in memorials and funerals in the same level. And I know that's a worry for a lot of people. And it is something I worry about, how people are going to really go through the grieving process without some of these rituals. And I think so, again, naming it, being able to talk about it with other people who get it helps. And we just may have some delayed rituals, or may have to find new rituals right now because they're things that we need in coping. Some of it is anticipatory grief. That's just, I worry about what's coming. Here's somebody with a chronic health issue, and I know at some point this will progress and they will decline and they will die. And now it feels even more immediate. If they go outside, if they continue the way they've always done things, there's a higher likelihood that they'll get sick, and will that mean that they're going to die? And that's going to come sooner. And so that weighs on us. There's a lot of ambiguity to these losses, that here's somebody that they're there, and yet they're not there in the same way that they were before. And right now, there's some things in our life that are the same. You know, we're still caregiving, we're still trying to work, we're still trying to deal with, you know, the repetitive questions or the memory loss, or the medications that they need, and yet it's all different. You know, we might be able to say within our home there's certain things that are same, and then the rest of the outside world feels very different right now. And so it's hard, and we need to give ourselves the space to experience these conflicting emotions, to be able to say, I'm going to grieve for everything that's lost because of their illness or their injury or their condition, also for what we're currently facing. And I also need to recognize what's still there. What can I still hold on to? What are the relationships maybe that I still have that I can lean on? What are the qualities of that person that are still there? You know, whether they still have a sense of humor, or whether they still maybe have more patience than I do. We want to still be able to recognize and hold on to those things. And that doesn't discount the losses, but again, it gives us that perspective, helps us from overgeneralizing and recognize what's still there, because those are the things that we can build off of. And those are the things that give us power as opposed to always losing it. You know, there's that idea of those 5 stages of grief that of course are not linear, that we go back and forth and cross through them and repeat them all over the place. And we're experiencing that right now, the anger about how did this get so bad? And well, if only I do these things, then I won't get it and they won't get it. You know, so we're experiencing all this related to the pandemic. We're experiencing it related to caregiving. And what we want to get to at the end is that place of acceptance. And that doesn't mean that we don't miss and are sad and hate the things that are lost. But the idea is that acceptance is what helps us move forward. So David Kessler is somebody who did a lot of work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created those 5 stages of grief, or named them at least. And in a recent article, and it's down here, and I told Jennifer I'll share these slides with everybody so that these links you're able to get. But he said acceptance, as you might imagine, is where the power lies. We find control in acceptance. I can wash my hands. I can keep a safe distance. I can learn how to work virtually. I can figure out how to keep somebody with dementia busy at home when they can't go out as much. Not to say it's going to be easy, but can I do it? But if I accept the reality of what our situation is, then I start to figure out what is it that I can do? What do I have control over? Versus when we're in those bargaining stages or denial or even anger, we're not recognizing what our reality is. And we often are trying to control and fight against the things that we can't control. And we want to get to the place where there's acceptance and there's power. And sometimes what we have to accept is what's important to the other person, because that may not match with what's important to us. For anybody who studied psychology, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the idea is that those bottom ones, the safety, the physiological needs, his thought was you have to have those before you get to those interpersonal needs, those needs of self-esteem and sense of purpose. And so if we look at that, then the thought is, okay, mom or dad or grandparents or whoever you're caring for, safety and security is what you should be focused on, which means you're not going to want to go outside when there's a pandemic. You're going to want to make sure you're safe. So why are you still doing these things? Why are you still going out to see friends or going to the store? You're not meeting your basic needs. And there's a nurse who wrote an article a few years ago called What If Maslow Was Wrong? And I don't know that it's wrong as much as sometimes that denial, if they don't recognize the severity of how the situation might affect their safety or security, then of course they're not going to be worried about it. Sometimes it's also what stage are they at in their life and what's important to them. And for somebody who's lived their whole life and has reached a point of being able to focus on what gives them purpose and what gives them meaning and accomplishment, it's hard for them to go back and say, let me just focus on the safety and security. And for someone with dementia, if there's any cognitive impairment, trying to convince them that there are safety issues is going to be a problem. They may not realize, well, no, I can't get up by myself because I might fall, or I can't turn on the stove and cook by myself because I'm going to forget and leave the oven on. They're not going to understand that. And so they are going to be focused on those higher level needs. And so the more we kind of understand where somebody is coming from and can accept that, it gives us some power to figure out, how do I communicate with them in a different way, understanding what matters most to them, and are there other ways I can help them meet those needs that might be safer in our current situation. So this is, I know, a really long quote, but I thought it just was so relevant right now. And it says, it can sometimes be freeing for someone who's caring for a parent or grandparent, regardless of the illness that they have, to acknowledge the limitations that they are under. Those can be financial limitations, those can be logistical limitations, but in this case, we are all grappling in every area of our life with new limitations that come from this virus that we didn't have 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and we are all struggling with how to adapt. And that is a struggle. But again, accepting those limitations, realizing what can you control, what can't you control, that's going to give you the best ability to try and make things better, because it will focus your energy and attention in certain areas. So how do we be more proactive? What are the things that we can do to try and manage this all a little bit better? The first is, what legal documents do you have in place for yourself as well as for the person that you're caring for? Caregivers often think about making sure that the other person has these in place, but especially right now, knowing that, well, people with compromised immune systems or other health issues, they may be at higher risk. Technically, any of us could get it. So if you're able to put things in place for yourself as well, that again is going to give you a little bit more control and power over what we're dealing with. So are there advanced healthcare directives? You know, have there been conversations about what type of care or treatment each person would want or not want? The POLST and the MOLST, that's the physician order for life-sustaining treatment or the medical order for life-sustaining treatment, depending on what state you live in. They have different names, but essentially they're the same thing. And so it is an order that says, would I want CPR? Would I want to be on a ventilator? Would I want a feeding tube? And those are going to vary depending on what someone's underlying medical conditions are. If you're young and relatively healthy, you might say yes. If it's somebody who has a lot of health issues, they might say no. And to give us all the most power and control, we want to be thinking about those things now. Do you have personal health records in place? What medication somebody is on, past histories of surgeries, allergies, any of that information. Again, we all should have it organized in some way that we have easy access to it, especially knowing that visitation issues are a huge problem right now in hospitals and healthcare facilities. So if you can't go, you want to make sure that you've got that information together in a way that somebody else is going to be able to read it and know who this person is, what are their major issues or concerns, who should they reach out to for more information, and even sometimes, you know, what's their favorite food, what's something that's relaxing to them. It could just also be those personal parts of who they are. And there's been a huge expansion of the availability of telehealth. And so those are ways that we can communicate with primary care providers, also with mental health support. And so use those. Find out what's available and find out what's available now before you need it. So you might call your primary care office and figure out, okay, if we start to have any health issues related to the virus or not, knowing that they don't really want people to come in if they can avoid it, how do we communicate with the doctor? Can we do video chats? Can we talk with you that way? There is something under Medicare and Medi-Cal that physicians can actually bill for advanced care planning conversations, not for treatments or any tests done, but just to have those conversations. And not many people have been using them in the past, but I think now is a time to do it. So again, thinking about what are the increased health risks right now, to be able to have those conversations. Let's not just fill out the Advanced Healthcare Directive, but let's actually have a video call with the doctor to say, okay, if something happened to me, if something happened to them, given our individual health statuses, what would that mean? What would that look like? And let's have those conversations. There are a lot of mental health platforms, and Jennifer and I were talking about this earlier. I'm always hesitant to name some of the specific platforms because depending on what state you live in and the state of the clinician, there's different licensing requirements. But I'd say reach out to your insurance. If you're still working and your job has an employee assistance program, both of those are places where you might be able to get mental health support and counseling. And a lot of therapists who weren't doing it before because of the loosened rules around telehealth are offering it now. So I think there's a lot more opportunities and options to get that emotional support by video chat. So I'd say look into those and really talk to people about that.
I just kind of want to stress
yeah.
I just wanted to stress the emotional benefit of having the emergency preparedness stuff in place, because I think a lot of time as a caregiver, you look at this list and you think, oh yeah, I do need to get this stuff in order, legal documents, whatever. I don't need it today, so I'll push it off, because honestly, it sucks to think about. Like, you're thinking about the worst case scenarios when you're doing this. But I think in this instance that's so acute, if we don't think of it as a logistical need, which it clearly is, but for our own mental health, because I'm hearing from so many people that are saying, all I can think about is what if they have to go to the hospital and I can't be there and be there. And just the stress of that unknown can be alleviated to some degree by having this like emergency packet, so to speak, like your go bag ready, just to know that you have something to rely on in that instance. I would think of it too as a big stress reliever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's stuff that we don't want to talk about. We don't like thinking about. We don't like talking about. And we always say, oh, at some point if I need it. And even now, you don't know for sure that you will. Things may turn out just fine for you. None of us ever know when we're going to need it. And things like advanced healthcare directives, everyone over the age of 18 should have one, regardless of your health. Because once you're 18 and there's an adult, there is no designated decision maker. You're an adult. So that's the time to really think about putting those documents in place. And, you know, if we're going to look for, are there any positives that come out of this? That might be one, is that we are hearing about more people are filling out advanced healthcare directives. The group that put together 5 Wishes, which is a variation on an advanced healthcare directive, I think they're reporting something like 3 times the number of requests for those documents. So we know people are doing that right now, but exactly, as Jennifer said, that gives you a little bit more power and control, and just trying to reduce some of those feelings of helplessness. And that can make a difference. So now is definitely the time to have those conversations. And there's lots of great tools and supports out there to help guide those conversations. A great one is the Conversation Project. They have a lot of really great resources if you're not sure kind of where to start. But that can be a great resource for that.
Christina, I just wanted to mention, I'm just looking at the time, and we have about 10 minutes left, but I also want to make sure you get through your presentation. So
so I'll try and jump through a few of these. Yeah, thank you. Really think about how you're communicating with people. Aikido is a way of really building up that empathy, to say, you know, I know you want to go out and see other people. I miss doing those things, but this is what I worry about, and finding a way to negotiate. Doesn't mean you're going to win, but it's a way to build that empathy, and it's a way to try and move that conversation forward in a way that the person might hear. Now, if it's someone with dementia, and all the rules are out the window, and we need to let go of that sense of being reasonable and rational and logical. We're not going to be able to necessarily get that person to understand the reality or come to an agreement. And so we often have to find other ways of getting them to kind of do what we need them to do. But it's not about controlling the person, it's just about shifting how we communicate. And that can be hard to do, but it's realizing that that is a way that we can potentially make more changes, is by watching how we communicate. I put these on here again. This is something I'll send out, so I won't go through it in a ton of detail, but just to know that there are crisis services in a caregiving role, places that you can reach out to. And then if you haven't really looked at the community resources that are available, Elder Care Locator can be a great way to start. And it's not just for older adults, but also adults with disabilities. And knowing that, again, we're seeing an increase in some of the services that are more phone-based or friendly visitor by phone. So really reach out and find out what's available in your community and try and tap into those if you can. These are also all on the handout that you got, so or that you will get. So, but just really, because there are a number of really great tools out there to keep people busy at home. Well Connected is a fantastic phone-based activity program. If you're caring for someone with dementia, the Alzheimer's stores are a great place for ideas. I will say they tend to be a bit more expensive, but it's organized really well. So it's a nice way to kind of get ideas about potential activities or games or things that you can do with somebody. And then you might just go Google if you can find them elsewhere cheaper. But it's a really great resource. Time Slips has wonderful ideas for creative engagement, again, friendly visiting programs, lots of great things as ways to kind of keep that person busy and keep yourself busy, things that you might be able to do together. And the other thing that's really important is to find those activities that are going to foster wellness, build resilience for you. And if you go back to that stress slide at the beginning, if you're somebody, so like myself, who my stress is very cognitive, it's very mental, I could go for a walk and I could still be thinking about and worrying about all those things in my head. So I really need to try and find activities that engage my brain. So if I'm going to go for a walk, it might be listening to a podcast. But things like reading and journaling might be really good for me. If you're somebody who that stress is very physical or behavioral, you want to try and tie those types of activities that help you release your stress with how you experience your stress, because you're going to find it tends to be more effective that way. Again, these don't make things go away, but it builds up your resilience. It builds up your ability to adapt and change. And that helps us cope. Doesn't make it go away, but it builds up our ability to cope with it so we don't get brought down so low by every new stressor that comes in. So figure out what works for you. It's not going to be the same across the board. And so you need to find out what's best for you and build more of these into your life right now. Because we need more of them, because the stress is more right now. So the more you can do these things, the better. And this is something, knowing that you have this online group, use each other to reinforce that. We do a multi-week class sometimes, and at the end of each class, we will ask people to name what they're going to do for themselves, and that way the group holds them accountable. So you might think about doing that. And then there's the simplest little things that I included in here, and if you may have seen this online, but it's a way to practice breathing. You know, you follow that to kind of breathe in and breathe out. And so if you just take like 1 second and do it now, 1 second. These are the little things that help kind of lower our blood pressure. And what I wanted to end with you is one of those not maybe new things, but things that are out there more now that for me help me relax is the jellyfish cam at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. You know, again, what are the things that are going to be soothing and relaxing for you and for the person you're caring for, and how do we build those into our lives? And so I'll leave this up as there's kind of any questions or comments, and I didn't leave a ton of time for it, but yeah, any last kind of thoughts or things that have come up?
Yeah, anybody feel free to use this time, just like a couple minutes really, to type in any questions that you have. We have one from Emily on advanced care planning. She asked, which doctor would one try to call about advanced care planning? Would it be my dad's personal doctor? Wouldn't it have to be someone at a hospital? And if so, how?
It does not need to be at a hospital. Ideally, you want to reach out to whoever their primary treating physician is. Most of those are done with the primary care doctor, but you might think about if like they have dementia or Parkinson's and there's a neurologist involved, that could be a good person because they're going to really understand kind of what the primary diagnosis is and how that might affect decisions around advanced care planning. But yeah, it's with whoever their main treating physician is to have that conversation. And advanced healthcare directives don't need to be notarized. They don't need to be done with an attorney. They just need two witnesses. So if you don't have two people kind of in the home right now that you can pull, you know, you might from a distance from 6 feet, ask a neighbor to sign off on it. But even if you've documented the choices and it's not a fully executed form, that still will help. You'll have had that conversation at least.
Great. At what point do you need to bring in a lawyer? Is that
for an advanced healthcare directive, you don't. As long as the person has capacity to make their own decisions, you really just need two witnesses to sign off on it. Now, if they're in a care facility, you do need the ombudsman to be one of the witnesses for it because they are advocates for people in long-term care facilities. So they're just making sure that there's no kind of bias or pressure. The only time you generally want to consult with an attorney is more around the legal and financial planning, not so much the healthcare planning.
Okay, got it. Emily said thank you. If anybody else doesn't have a question, I'll give you a couple seconds to get it out there, but nobody else has chimed in. Then, Christina, I'm just going to say thank you so much. As she mentioned, there's a handout that she's put together that's really fantastic that I will be emailing out to all of the attendees of this webinar. And this webinar will be made available through the Caregiver Collective Facebook group, so you can rewatch it if you'd like to, because I know we try and cram a lot of info into an hour to be mindful of everybody's time, even if we're all indoors. So, you know, feel free to rewatch. And Christina, thank you so much. You're so helpful, so knowledgeable, and have such a way of speaking about it that's very easy to comprehend. So thank you for giving your time to us.
Absolutely. And, you know, I just kind of find a message. I hope everyone, you know, take care of yourself. And, you know, I think that support that you're able to provide each other is amazing. And so I hope people are able to kind of continue doing that and, you know, find those things that just make your day a little bit easier, because it does make a difference over time.
Absolutely. All right. Ellie says thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you again.
All right.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.